Good morning, everyone. I just want to see everybody can hear me good? All right. Okay, so first of all, thanks everyone for being here. Now, the slide that you see there, that is not the way any of us like to start our Monday mornings. But many of us have, right? With some kind of security event. Now, of course, security events tend not to be that considerate. That tends not to wait for Monday mornings. It tends to be more of a Friday evening affair, if any of you've had that experience. But one of the questions that comes up is, okay, well, these things happen, and then, of course, we go through a long process. It's a bit like reconstructing an airline crash, and all the details get together, and in the end, it turns out that the reason tends to always sort of be the same. The wrong person or the wrong thing, and I'll come back to the things, that is, I think, one of our big blind spots is we focus on people, and we forget about all the other things that have permissions in our systems. But someone or something had access to information that it shouldn't have had. And that, turns out, is usually an identity and ultimately an authorization failure, right? A failure in authorization that happens. And when that happens, then, if you're unfortunate, it ends up being front page news, or you have to sort of go through this whole process about finding out what happened and dealing with the difficulty of that, right? Because sometimes, and I'll talk about brownfield systems later on, one of the challenges that we have is our authorization systems are highly heterogeneous. We don't get to just have one authorization system, especially if you have a large, complicated environment that's evolved over many, many years. So the question becomes, right, what can we do about this? Of course, right, one of the big things, if you want to reduce your risk profile, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you haven't done already, start deploying multi-factor authentication. That is one of the best ways to make sure that you at least know the someone, and then you can start having an idea about the decisions, the what they have access to piece. But authentication is not authorization, right? Just because I know who you are and I can verify your identity doesn't mean that you get to have access to everything. And that is very often one of the challenges, right, that we've seen with credential theft. If I can steal your credential and I can get into a system, suddenly I can have very broad access, right? And this is especially true for workloads. And that's a bit of a pet topic. We'll come back to those as well. So definitely do turn on that authentication piece. And as an industry, we have made enormous progress around authentication over the last 20 years, right? We've really managed to externalize authentication from the rest of our applications, and we can upgrade and evolve that over time. But for authorization, and this is something that Sarah and I have been talking about over the last year or so, we have not made that much progress yet, right? With authorization is still very deeply connected with our business logic, and it's evolved over a significant amount of time, and it's very difficult to really sort of tease that out. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to start talking a little bit about what is this journey that we need to get on, and as an industry, where do we need to go to get to a better future. Now, of course, right, the first question about, okay, better future, it's like, Peter, like, what is that better future, right? Where is that better future and what does that look like? And for that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to come and tell us a little bit about this future that we're envisioning, this dream that we have of where we want to go with authorization. Sarah.
So before we start speaking in the abstract about managing permissions, we want to give you some concrete user stories so that you have an idea of what we're talking about. Peter and I and most people in this room deal with workforce or B2C identity, but we found it's actually easier to explain the concepts that we're talking about when we use household identity. So I am going to use the Jetsons. How many of you were raised on American cartoons? Okay, I'm in a friendly room here. So those of you who weren't the Jetsons were like a futuristic family in American cartoon my childhood. So imagine, if you will, that George's flying car has to check whether he has a pilot's license. This is what we would call a centralized policy. So the car itself does not hold the policy. The car calls out to some cloud, some on-prem server, and that server has information about George's age, about whether his license is valid, about whether it's been revoked. And it does all of that compute in a central place, and then it returns to the car an allow or deny. So the car itself does not make that decision. The car itself does not have that information. That's what we're calling a centralized policy in this talk. The women of the Jetsons household are Judy and Jane. Judy is the wild teenager. And let's imagine that, so Jane is her mother. Let's imagine that Jane has grounded Judy. And Jane and Judy have this fancy hairdryer that gives them whatever hairstyle they want in like seconds. It's amazing. And so Jane has told Judy, you are not allowed to use the hairdryer for a week. And she sets a policy in their household console that says, Judy is forbidden from using the hairdryer. Now that policy is locally administered, locally authored, locally stored. So that is what we are calling a local or an application policy in this talk. And then there's a third kind of policy that I want to give you a mental model for, which is what we're calling a distributed or decentralized policy. So the Jetsons have a robot maid. Her name is Rosie. And Rosie has a super powerful vacuum, right? And so let's imagine that like it's sort of in beta and they're not sure if it's really good to have around humans yet. And so every time she updates her firmware, Rosie also updates her policy set. And for right now, that super powerful vacuum says, hey, don't use me when there are humans in the room. And so that policy is written and it's administered centrally, but it's distributed and evaluated locally. So that's what we're calling a decentralized or distributed policy. So those are the three use cases that we're going to be talking about today. And this is the kind of future that, that Peter and I want you guys to be able to see. So that was our cold open. We're cool like Saturday Night Live. And now we will go back and do our introductions, now that we've grabbed you, hopefully, and helped you understand what we are passionate about. So I am Sarah Cicchetti. This is Peter Castleman. We work for competing companies. I work for Amazon, Peter works for Microsoft, but we work together. We work together at the Internet Engineering Task Force, we work together at the OpenID Foundation, because in order to create this future where there are interoperable security boundaries, we have to have interoperable standards. And so it's really important in the niche field of information security called identity and access management that people who compete work together to make sure that our systems have the same security protocols. So to give you some history about me, I used to be a developer. I fell into identity sideways. I loved it. I started a consultancy. I started a professional organization for identity nerds. It's called ID Pro. You should all join. Then I worked at Ping for a hot minute, and now I work at Amazon, and Amazon is funding me to work on an open source project called CEDAR, and CEDAR is a policy language that is designed to be analyzable, secure, and highly readable. And so all of the policy examples that you'll see today are written in CEDAR. And Peter, tell these fine people who you are.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm Peter Castleman. I am an identity enthusiast. I first started dabbling with identity back in the mid-1990s when I worked on developing and training neural networks to identify people-based and authenticate people based on their typing patterns. Now, you know, it sort of worked. But it took another 25, 30 years before the technology finally caught up and have made that very much, it sounds way less exotic now than it did 25 years ago. Sort of dabbled within the information security space, cryptography, spent a couple of years working as security analyst in financial institutions. And currently, I have the incredible privilege to be working at Microsoft on some of the world's most interesting authorization problems, problems at scale. And to Sarah's point, this is actually one of the things that motivates me most about this. This is not a single company problem. This is an industry level problem. This is about securing the very core of our infrastructures and everybody in this rooms to keep our customers secure, to keep our systems secure, and to protect our civilization and our societies, right? It is really, really critical that we collaborate and make sure that we have the right standards with the right capabilities that everybody can use and can be interoperable with.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. What are we going to do for the next 4 hours? No, we won't do that. So Sarah painted this picture of where we can get to, right? What is it? What does our destination look like? So the question becomes, okay, so what do we do? How do we get there? And so we're going to talk about 7 steps. Now, why 7? Well, I think my corporate vice president, Alex Simons, likes to point out when you share something with people, make it a prime number. 3, 5, 7. And so this is a big topic, so we're going to need 7 steps. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about what questions to ask. And this really comes down, before we can ask a question, we need visibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about visibility and all the things that we need visibility on. For authorization management, you cannot manage what you cannot see, right? This is really important. Now, I'll talk more about that. And then Sarah will talk a little bit about, once you have visibility, thinking about your strategies around the different layers that you can have, right? What should you centralize? What can you decentralize? What should be distributed and cached, right? And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things that you should always have, right? Any authorization system, whether it's a greenfield, new build, or brownfield, which is the thing that most of us end up working with as well. What do we always need to think about? And then a couple of details, right? Really important things that I think can easily be overlooked in the excitement and rush to build out and secure these authorization systems. So, step 1. Asking the right questions, getting visibility. As my father used to point out to me, or still points out to me, time spent on reconnaissance is never wasted. Even when you learn that everything is exactly as you thought it should be, that is information too. And so I would definitely encourage you, like if you haven't got visibility in your environment, right, do make the effort. So the question, of course, is what should you have visibility on? Of course, right? Let's start with users and groups. Be sure, have good visibility into your user population, understand how the join, move, leave process works, and also understand how they get assigned to groups, right? Groups is a key, let's call it building block for any authorization system, because it allows us to operate at scale. But those groups, how do people get assigned to the groups? When they leave a group, how does that happen? When a join, move, leave event happens, what is how sure are you that people's removed from the right groups, that they don't end up with supersets, right? When I move from one role to another, do I drag all my old permissions with me, or do I get new ones? And the other thing to watch out for, understand what happens, right? Is there a short window in which I have for 24 or 48 hours? Is there a risk? And I'll talk more about risk in a minute. But what are your risks in that join, move, leave process? So users and groups, right? And actually, I think most people here probably have a fairly good idea of what that looks like already. Often your join, move, leave motions often are tightly coupled to your HR systems. And that's kind of really traditional identity, right? We really think about that a lot. The next type of thing that you should really get a view on, and this is a personal passion of mine, it's an area that I'm spending a lot of time on right now, is around workload and workload identity. How many people in the room feel like they know exactly how many workload identities they have, who's creating them, what permissions they have? Yeah? Okay. Either people are asleep or you've got work to do. So workloads are interesting because their join, move, leave motion is very different from users. They join, move, and leave as part of your DevOps operation. And that's a space that we haven't really been, as identity professionals, paying that much close attention to. There's some really interesting statistics in this space. I think things that I've seen, something like 80% of workload identities that get created are never used. So that's a problem, right? Because unused identities are things that I can get hold of, and if nobody is monitoring or managing them, who knows what I can do with them. The other part, right, to just add to your terror, only about 5% of the permissions that is generally assigned to workloads are actually needed. So they don't actually, and so it's a very common pattern, right? Because developers, their job is to make things work, right? And their preferred authorization policy is allow star, because that way they know it's not the authorization policy that's breaking everything, right? And so how we think about that is really key, and how we still empower our developers to be productive, but giving visibility to those of us responsible for the authorization and authentication infrastructures of our organizations is key. So please, if you haven't done so, I want to plead with you, go and figure out what's happening with your workload identities, because they're so vastly overprivileged, right? A workload typically can access way more information than an individual, right? Your batch process that runs to do payroll can access everybody, whereas maybe I can only see what if I go to my employee benefits portal, I can see what I get paid, but that workload that's doing the batch process, it sees everything. If somebody gets hold of that identity and they get that authorization permissions, that's a very powerful thing. So please get a view on your workloads. Next thing, org structure. Why is the org structure important? Well, Sarah's going to talk about this, but these authorization systems, especially as we go to fine-grained authorization systems, it's really important to know who in the organization is best positioned to have an opinion about which authorization policy, what the authorization policy should be, can judge whether an existing policy is okay or not. And so really understanding how your organization and how you're going to think about your organization in terms of rolling out this sort of layered authorization strategy becomes really, really important too. Brownfield versus greenfield. As technologists, it's very tempting for us to say, oh yeah, we talk about greenfield, the new technology, right? The new thing we're going to build, and we'll do some of that today as well. How many people in the room have only one authorization system? Okay, how many have more than one authorization system? Oh wow, I love an honest audience. Those who didn't put up your hands, if you don't have one and you don't have more than one, I hope you have at least authentication, right? Because if it's not for that, you have no control. One of the things I'd say, Sarah will talk about this sort of structure, but please go and think about and enumerate your existing brownfield authorization systems and start thinking about how they interact with one another, right? When you build a new greenfield system, invariably it's going to have to interact with this old brownfield system. And how's that going to work, right? Is that your weakest link or not, right? Or just thinking through that. And of course, brownfield systems are tricky, right? You can't just pull them out because remember when I started, I talked about how your business logic is intertwined with your authorization logic. That's your brownfield systems, right? They tend to have that characteristic. So it's very hard to get out of them. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about potential strategies around that as well. And And then I think once you've got visibility, once you've sort of done this reconnaissance, you can now think about risk. What are your, I'm going to call it your operational risks around this, the management, what are the management risks around this? And then in terms of the risks for your, I'm going to call it the business risk, right? The risk that your executive team is worrying about. How do you connect this, right? From, hey, I'm deploying some, in a decentralized distributed world, I have somebody out in a field office deploying an authorization policy, or I have an engineer in a development team creating an authorization policy. How does that bubble back to the business risk that your executive team have to sign off on, right? Thinking through that, and how do you orchestrate across all of that? So I think with that, I'm going to ask Sarah to come and talk a little bit about the different strategies for layering and how that can help to minimize risks.
All right, so for those of you who learn better from graphs than cartoons, we'll go over again what the 3 layers are. And they're not mutually exclusive. So these are layers that you want to have literally layered on top of each other. So you might be doing 2 or 3 authorization calls for any given action that your application performs. So the y-axis here is where the policy is administered, locally or centrally. And by centrally, we mean that might be AWS, that might be Azure, that might be on-prem. It is where your central policy store exists. And then the x-axis here is where it is stored and where it's evaluated. So the first one is your central policy store. Stored centrally, administered centrally. This was the George's Flying Car example. Then you have your application policy store, your local policy store. Administered locally, stored locally, does not leave whatever the device or the application is. And then you have your distributed policy store, which is stored and evaluated locally, but cached from a central place where it is administered and written. So these are your 3 policy store types. And you might have more than one policy store in each, but these are the 3 types that we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing you should think about is what policies you want to centralize in your organization. And there are 6 reasons why you might want to centralize policy. The first is control. If there is anything that your executive team wants sweeping control over, you should centralize that. So if your CISO wants to be able to say, only applications written by the finance department can have access to the credit card numbers, those sorts of things should be centralized. The second is consistency. If there is a permission where you want everyone to access it in the same place, in the same way, and be logged in the same place, that you would want to centralize. Security. If there are compliance or regulatory reasons, or if your security team has internal regulations having to do with what permissions should be centralized, that's a good reason to do it. If you need to do centralized analysis. So you might be aware of a risk factor that someone is going to attack your system, and if those attacks are coming into local applications, they might not recognize, hey, these are all coming from the same IP address if that policy is distributed. And so if you centralize that policy and you make everyone do a call to the central policy store, you can do that whole analysis there and you can alarm more quickly. The 5th reason is sensitivity. If you have patient data, if you have credit card data, if you have things that for some reason you do not want to push into local applications, if you need that information in order to evaluate this policy, that's a good reason to centralize. And the last is privacy. If your users have not consented to have their information pushed into local applications, that's a good reason to centralize. So these are all the reasons why you might want to put a policy into your central policy store. So this is an example of a policy that you might want to have for centralization. Sorry, it's hard to read that blue text on this projector, but this is a policy that says we are going to permit doctors to prescribe controlled substances only if they've been referred and they've completed a consent form. So a controlled substances consent form is not something that you would want to have distributed all over your applications. This is something that you would want to store locally, or store centrally in your central policy store. So what permissions should you decentralize? Anything that requires low latency. So if you're going to have a central policy, that has to call back. It has to call out to a cloud, it has to call back to an on-prem server. If you need extremely low latency, you should be evaluating that policy in your local application on the edge. That's gonna be much faster and it's gonna be much cheaper, both in terms of dollars and in terms of time. If you have low or no internet connection, if you're dealing with a cruise ship, with a satellite, with those sorts of use cases, centralized policy store isn't gonna work for you. If the application itself needs to write policies, that's gonna be much faster if you do it locally. And lastly, if there's no applicability outside of one application, nobody else needs to know that Judy can't use the hairdryer this week. There's no reason to do the expense of storing that locally and going and evaluating it, or storing that centrally and going and evaluating it centrally. So this is an example of a policy that would only be applicable within one application. So this is a photo app. It says, permit the user Alice to view the vacation photo, permit the user Stacy to view the photo in the account Stacy. These are kinds of things, they don't need to leave the application. It only has to do with the user on that machine. So step 5, what should you distribute in cache? Everything but the kitchen sink. If you don't have a good reason to centrally store this policy, and you don't have a good reason to locally store this policy, you should distribute it and cache it. So this is your RBAC, this is your ABAC, this is your Nickelback. Everything else that goes into your policy store that is not centralized or local should be distributed in cache. This is really the cheap way to do it, and that way you have all of the policies centrally, you can analyze them. So this is an example of a really simple RBAC policy. Only people in the finance department can access the finance database. So, with that groundwork in your authorization system, it enables you to do some auditing and governance of all of your system that will buy you a lot in terms of security and usability. And Peter's going to talk to you more about that.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so once you figured out what it is that you want to decentralize, what it is that you want to distribute, cache, and what you need to control centrally, now you have a nice framework to start. Oops, I think I just pressed the wrong button. Didn't press the wrong button. Now you have a strong framework to start thinking about audit, right? Audit is, and we call it the audit logs, and often that is sort of like, oh, the auditors want to see that. Actually, you want to see that, right? Because the information in your audit logs, if you think about control systems, that is your feedback loop, right? That is what's telling you whether the system is working the way you intended to or not. This is where you will find out that, hey, here is an identity that I thought was decommissioned a long time ago, or here is an identity that nobody has any record of creating, or here was an identity that was created and an authorization policy that goes with it that hasn't been updated in a decade, right? What's up with that? So your audit logs, of course, we started out talking about an event, a security event. Yes, you want those, and you want them to be easily accessible, analyzable, all of those good things. But what you really want to think about your audit logs is, this is your signal coming back. And you want to process around looking at that, investing in the tools to sort of even help with automated reasoning over them. And I think this is where some of the new technologies that's emerging, things like the Cedar policy language, really interesting. It really helps to facilitate and make that automated reasoning easier. Now, you don't have to go and change everything for that, but that might be a space to go and invest in, right? Make sure that you have common visibility, etc. The other thing, right, Sarah talked about decentralized and distributed policy and authorization. That's actually really, really critical, especially if you're in a manufacturing environment. I actually want to get a sense, who in this room, folks here in the have manufacturing? Right, got somebody at the back. So in those environments, right, they don't have great connectivity. They often need to be able to continue to operate even if you lose connectivity to a centralized service, and you need very low latency, right? You cannot, like if you have high latency in authorization decisions, that ends up impacting your production, and that's not a good thing, right? You definitely don't want that to happen. But when you're disconnected, right, be sure to have a mechanism for reconciling when that system comes back up, right? What happened while the system was offline? How are those audit logs coming back? And then can you reconstruct everything that happened while you were offline? So the audit piece, absolutely critical, and really thinking about the ability to continuously inspect and understand those audit logs. And that sort of leads into the topic of governance. Again, governance is a big, scary word, right? But in many ways, it just means that you're managing your environment and you are constantly reviewing. And you're holding the people. Remember how I talked about the organization and understanding your organizational structure, right? Who is authorized to create policies, who created the policy, who set up that identity and granted it certain permissions. You need to know that, and that needs to show up in your audit logs, but you need to know that otherwise you can't do governance. And so the way governance, or governance at scale, right? If you're in a large organization, it's impossible for one team to be constantly reviewing all of these policies and understanding how they apply to the business. It's really the business owners, right? It's that stuff that you distributed and decentralized in your organization, as Sarah talked about. And so pushing the responsibility back through things like access reviews, right? Is this person still working for you? Are they still working on this project? This workload that was created, is it still needed? Why has it not been used in 12 months? Right? If something's been inactive for 12 months, you should ask that question. Now, with workloads, it turns out, some of them are around simply because they only run once a year, right? They do the Christmas bonus. And so you don't want to just go delete them. So you need to know who to ask. Why does this thing exist? You probably also want to invest in some just-in-time provisioning for your identities. Different topic for a different day. So, I think as you think about this, having both the audit piece and then governance, right? Continuously, these two things reinforcing one another, and having your audit information feed your governance efforts. So, then finally, right, a couple of details, right? What are the additional things that we ought to be thinking through? Things that are easily forgotten. So we talked about governance, but also just policy reviews, right? And again, observability of your system. So one, authorization systems are tricky things. Make sure that you can trust your policy decision points, make sure that they're always up, and also understand what the applications will do when those things are down, right? When they are down, right, can respond in different ways. One strategy is to say, if I can't get an authorization decision, I just cut access, right? There's another strategy that says, oh, I can't get access, I'm going to grant access, right? Don't do that. But you can see the pressure for that. So understand when that is happening and have that sort of near real-time monitoring of your system and invest in that analysis piece. We're going to talk about break loss for a moment. Break loss, that is absolutely critical to have, right? It's part of continuity. Availability is a big part of security, right? And so sometimes you need to break the glass and bypass your authorization system because you need to bring up an environment, you need to clean out an environment, you need to go outside the normal parameters of the authorization policies that you created. And we all have those, right? They're absolutely critical. Now, When somebody breaks the glass, what you don't want to do is a silent break glass, because what you don't want to happen is for somebody to have the ability to bypass, to switch off your authorization system. So when there's break glass, make it loud, right? Fire alarms, have different people in different reporting chains, have them aware. And then the other thing is, after the event, do the reconciliation. Because for a short moment in time, you have suspended all expectation about what your authorization system should be doing, because you're trying to get your system back up, right? You're dealing with an emergency. But go back, those audit logs that I talked about earlier, make sure there's nothing in there that snuck in while you were dealing with the emergency, right? Well, was there suddenly a spike in requests for data from a system that you don't usually see? Was that expected, right? So while you're, when you bypass your authorization system, please make sure to go back and clean that up. Monitoring and alerting. So let's talk about that for a moment. When you start, and it's back to the observability piece as well, when you start seeing denies on requests, that is usually a good indicator that something is not right. Because usually, you're setting it up in such a way that there should never be a normal flow where deny is a common occurrence, right? So deny events, that signal that either somebody is doing something they're trying something, right? They're maybe it's just a developer writing code and making a mistake and trying to debug their system. That is one reason you're suddenly seeing denies on things you didn't expect. Or it could be somebody that is trying their luck. So, when you see that sort of abnormal deny patterns, that's a good thing, but go investigate and understand why, right? And I think that's a really important signal, right? Don't ignore the denies, even if they're just sort of showing up occasionally, right? Somebody is trying something they shouldn't. And then finally, brownfield, right? If only we could build only greenfield new systems, but we don't live in that world. So what do we do about brownfield? I think back, right, if you think about what we talked about, visibility, know that they exist. The next thing is make sure you can audit them. Understand how they interact with each other and any new system that you're building. And then there is that question about, do you rebuild them, right? Do you turn your brownfields into greenfields? Should you think about, okay, maybe I put a service mesh around some of my existing systems to help distribute and manage these policies. Should I look at some sort of microsegmentation strategies, right? Is that a path that you want to go for your brownfield scenarios? Or at the very least, just go invest in that audit and visibility piece as well. So some additional details to think about. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, okay, so what next, right? Because we've given you a lot of information. We talked about some very concrete things. We talked about more abstract things. But what should you do next? And for that, I'm going to hand back to the fairy godmother of authorization, Sarah.
He says fairy godmother because the next thing you have to do is make a wish. But literally, like the first thing you should do today is decide what in your organization do you want to throttle through with Central Policy Store. Do you want to say, look, I don't care where on the globe you're developing, I don't care what cloud you're developing in, I don't care what language you're developing in, if you want access to credit card numbers, you have to go through this API gateway, and this API gateway has to be protected by this policy store, right? So that could be, I want to hire an employee, I want access to patient data, I want to disable an industrial machine, right? These sorts of important things where you want control or you have sensitivity, make a list of those things and say, this is what I really wish I could centralize across all of my development teams. A month from now, figure out how you're building permissions today. One of the things that Peter and I see a lot is that people are building permissions directly into application logic. So if you see in your code things like roles or things like attributes, if there are if statements in there with those things, that's really dangerous. That means that your permissions are in fact encoded in your application, and you need to get them out because that is chaos and that is incident response, and you're not going to have visibility and you're not going to be able to proactively control your permissions if they're in your business logic and in your application code. So get them out, put them in a separate policy store where you can see everything and you can analyze everything. And then a year from now, build and enforce those policy layers. Have a centralized policy store. Have each application, each development team gets their own policy store where they get to write and enforce whatever they want. And these things are layered, right? So just because they write and enforce a policy locally doesn't mean that they can override what happens centrally. If they want credit card numbers, they still have to go through that throttled API. And then what you want to distribute in cache. So I hope that Peter and I today have helped you understand that we want a CISO job, a security job, to be a proactive job. That we don't want you doing incident response. We don't want you living in chaos. There is a better future, and that future is to have organized policy stores and throttled information points. And this will help you take your organization to a place where you can have a day of silence, a day of no alarms, a day where you can say, I actually know what Sarah has access to, where you can answer that question. So with that, I will say thank you. And we have 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions, we are being recorded, so please come to the mics so that we can get them on tape.
Hello.
Hi.
There's so many things in your presentation. I have about 10 questions, but I'm going to only ask 2. Give somebody else a chance. The first thing is less of a question, more of an observation, but I'd like your comment. And that's one of the first things you talked about, Sarah, was you're a developer and you were talking about doing permissions or authorizations correctly. It's been my observation that the biggest thing that gets in the way and why people build those structures in to applications is because they believe in something called intended use. They just don't know what it is. They don't even conceive of unintended use. Their normal reaction is, well, why would anybody do that with a credit card application?
Exactly.
So your thoughts about that?
For sure. Part of the reason why we think it's really important to have an external policy store that is external to your application code is because you can do that sort of automated analysis, auditing, governance, so that you can keep track of what attacks are possible, what risks am I taking in my organization. Without that, if it's all embedded in the application code, you don't have that visibility.
But how do we talk to developers and communicate with them, not just yak at them, but communicate with them about the dangers of the assumption of only intended use? How do we communicate to them that there is unintended use and they are the first line of defense against unintended use?
Is it terrible if I say I think they don't care about unintended use?
Oh, I know they don't care.
But I think they do care about code maintenance. And if we tell them, look, your code is actually going to be shorter. It's going to be fewer lines. It's going to be easier to maintain if you let the security team handle the policy. And the only thing that's in your code is one call that says, is authorized. Is it authorized? Yes, do it. And that is authorized call calls out to the policy store, and we do all the work. We maintain all of those policies. You don't have to maintain any of that code. I think that's how we get developers to adopt this architecture.
And then the second question is kind of directed a little more towards Peter, but only because he's from Microsoft, but I'm not going to hold that against you.
Oh, no.
And you talked about, or I don't remember which one of you mentioned RBAC versus ABAC, but Peter, you talked about users and groups, I believe.
Yeah.
And in my view, because I'm very much an ABAC kind of person, because I see users and groups as part of the problem. It builds what I call a monolith. People just, the administrators, the identity access folks, stick someone in a group and they leave them there. And then when someone doesn't have access to something, they add that authorization to that group. And then suddenly everybody in that group has access. And so I think the monolith and users and groups is the problem. Your thoughts?
Yes. So I think the reason that happens, by the way, is because users and groups turns out to be a very scalable way for people to try and deal with some of these authorization decisions, but it has that side effect. I think increasingly I'm thinking less about, I'm going to speak my perspective. I'm thinking less about users and groups and things like ABAC and RBAC, really thinking about policy-based access control. And how, one of the other reasons why users and groups is so commonly used is, well, it has history, right? Those brownfield systems already work this way. It's sort of a shortcut, right, for people to do this. We're not going to get away from them, but when we start thinking about, like, what is an authorization policy really? Does this principal have access, or can they take this action on this resource under these conditions, right? And the conditions is that's the ABAC piece. And so depending on where you put your emphasis, RBAC puts the emphasis on the principal, right? Are you in this group? ABAC, is it the set of conditions, right? And I think thinking more about how do we write those policies and then make it very easy. Sarah touched on this. We have to make it so easy for developers. Authorization needs to get built into the compute infrastructure, into the DevOps pipeline. And it should be just, it should be more work to do the wrong thing than the right thing, right? It's this pit of success that we want people to fall into. But our brownfield environments are there, and we're going to have to keep managing them until we get to this new world.
Yeah. Thank you. So if you take these concepts and you try to implement or take them in implementation of zero trust when you want just in time and just enough access, there is a risk that some of the centralized policies can become a single point of failure because everything is calling back. What are the strategies to basically take the advantage of the centralized policy development places, but reduce the risk of becoming a single point of failure when you are trying just in time, just enough?
Yeah, so when you're doing just-in-time provisioning or authorization, it's actually less of a point of failure at the central point, because when you are provisioning access and saying, okay, Peter now has access to shut off this industrial machine, that is hopefully short-lived access, right? So if you're doing it just in time, then you're also taking it away because you know you can get it back whenever you need it. And so that's actually a great way to prevent it being a honeypot and a single point of failure, is to have those short-lived permissions and then take them away so that there is less surface area for an attacker to get at.
But if you're having a situation where the app is calling the policy enforcement, like an API gateway or something like that, and it's trying to call back and say, what is the policy for this? Should I grant access to Peter, and et cetera? If that callback doesn't work, would you leverage maybe the caching capability? That's the piece I'm trying to make that connection. If that central one is not there to answer, I don't want to fail open, right?
Yeah, no, please don't. Do not fail open. So actually one of the things that we're beginning to look at, if in the standard space, there's a set of work happening, the workload identity and multi-system environments. And one of the things that comes up in those discussions is this idea of not just how far down into the compute infrastructure, how far into the edge can we push the decision, right? So, and for which policies, to Sarah's point, some of them you never want to let go down to the edge. But for some of them, we say, well, if you look at how things like SPIFFE, for example, the Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone, Cloud Native Compute Foundation, how that works, that can work in a very decentralized, highly robust way, because you can issue identities down to a cluster level, right, in a Kubernetes cluster, maybe even down at a node level, right? You can go that far. And so for some of those policies, right, and the beauty that you get from being able to push your decision that far down, both for issuance of identity but also for authorization decisions, if you can push it that far down in a secure way, you also score on latency and resiliency, right? And so I think it's really, to Sarah's earlier point, knowing where you want to do that, and then the level of confidence that you have in pushing some of those. Which of those decisions are less risky to push out to the edge? I think I would think about it that way.
Thank you.
And with that, they're going to kick us out of the room,
Oh,
so
no.
we have to go. If you guys would like to see more talks with competitors working together, if you'd like to see more talks about authorization, please fill out the speaker survey and let the speaker committee know. Thank you very much, and Peter and I will be out in the hall if you have more questions.
Thank you.